Have you ever walked into a room believing your value was crystal clear, your numbers undeniable? I had. I carried mine in a simple leather folder, $8 million in verified savings, a system I had built from the ground up, and a quiet request for 12%. I had rehearsed every possible outcome in my head: a negotiation, a polite refusal, maybe even a promise for the next quarter. The one scenario I never prepared for was the sound of laughter. It wasn't loud. It was a soft, dismissive scoff that told me in an instant that I wasn't seen as an architect, but as a utility, a tool that had simply done its job. So if you're watching this right now, maybe in your car, maybe on your lunch break, just tell me one thing. Where are you listening from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels, and if something in you recognizes something in this, stay with me. My name is Sarah, and for the last 8 years, I have been a systems architect at Juno Corporation. My job, by design, was never to be in the spotlight. It was to be the quiet, invisible foundation beneath it, the person who made sure the complex machinery of our global logistics moved with such seamless elegance that no one ever had to think about it. I was raised to believe in data over drama, in elegant solutions over office politics. I held the naive conviction that if the work was good enough, it would speak for itself. That was my first and most profound mistake. The chief executive officer's office was on the top floor, a world of polished mahogany and soundproof glass that seemed to float above the city. I sat across from the man who ran it all, Marcus Thorne, feeling the familiar weight of my leather-bound report. Inside were pages dense with numbers and clean, undeniable charts. They represented more than just data. They were the artifacts of 1,000 sleepless hours, the proof of an obsession to create something not just functional, but nearly perfect. The new automated routing platform I designed had saved the company a verified $8 million in just 2 quarters, and I had come to present the facts. I walked him through the data with a calm precision, pointing out the cascading efficiencies and the millions in operational waste we had permanently eliminated. My voice was steady as I reached the final page. Based on this direct and significant contribution to our bottom line, I concluded, I believe a 12% salary adjustment is a fair reflection of that value. I finished my sentence and held his gaze, expecting a discussion, a negotiation, the professional exchange of two people looking at the same set of facts. Marcus didn't look at the report again. He simply leaned back in his expensive leather chair, the kind that was too well made to ever creak, and a small, dry smile touched his lips. It was then that the sound came, the quiet, dismissive scoff that I had not prepared for. He looked at me, his eyes glossing over with polite boredom, not as a valued employee, but as if I were a mildly interesting puzzle he had just solved. "Sarah," he said, his voice smooth and patronizing, "we reward architects of the company's vision, not the janitors who keep the lights on. You've been well compensated for that. You've done your job, and this report is the outcome." In that one moment, the entire room went silent. The low hum of the city outside the expansive glass faded away. My hand holding the folder didn't tremble. It simply went still, my fingers pressing into the leather. He hadn't just said no. He had drawn a line in the sand, placing me on the side of maintenance while he stood on the side of creation. He saw a perfectly running engine, but had no curiosity about the person who designed and built every gear from a blank page. The greatest innovation of my career, the system that was now our company's core advantage, was, in his eyes, just janitorial work. I collected my report from the polished table, my movements deliberate and slow. "I see," I said, my voice as neutral as I could make it. "Thank you for your time." He thought it was over, but in that moment I made a decision. I wouldn't get angry. I would get organized. I walked back to my desk through the open plan office, the familiar landscape of cubicles and quiet chatter suddenly feeling like a foreign country. The ambient noise of keyboards clicking and phones ringing softly seemed to bend around me, as if I were encased in a bubble of profound silence. My mind replayed his words, not with the heat of indignation, but with the cold, analytical precision of a system diagnosing a fatal error. He hadn't just misjudged my value, he had revealed the fundamental operating principle of the entire machine, a machine I now saw with perfect, chilling clarity. Credit flows up while work trickles down. When I sat down, my computer screen was still on, displaying our company's internal homepage. Dominating the page was a large, professionally shot photograph of Marcus Thorne, smiling with a confidence that seemed boundless. The headline beneath it read, "A New Vision, Marcus Thorne's Leadership Transforms Our Supply Chain." I read the article, a masterpiece of corporate prose that spoke of synergistic realignment and top-down strategic implementation. It was describing my system, my architecture, the one I had poured my life into, but my name was nowhere to be found. My identity had been stripped away and replaced by the smiling face of a man who likely couldn't tell a server from a spreadsheet. I was a ghost in my own creation. My gaze drifted from the screen to a small glass award in the corner of my desk, collecting a thin layer of dust. It was for Employee of the Year, dated 7 years ago, a relic from a time when I still believed that consistent, excellent work would eventually be seen. For a moment, I considered wiping the dust away. Instead, I picked it up, felt its cold, meaningless weight in my hand, and deliberately turned it face down. The small, quiet thud was heard by no one, but for me, it was the sound of a contract being broken, a faith being renounced, a silent personal severance from the company I had given my best years to. That night, I did not sleep. I went home and began a new project, one that was not commissioned by Juno Corporation and would never appear in any of their reports. On my personal computer, I began to build an archive. I subscribed to a highly encrypted private cloud service based in a country known for its strict privacy laws. This wasn't about theft, it was about preservation. I pulled out old hard drives and dusty notebooks from my closet, a library of my own intellectual journey. For years, I had documented my work for myself, a habit born from a love for the process. Now that habit had found its true purpose. I methodically scanned every page of handwritten notes, every diagram scribbled on a napkin at a late-night diner, every architectural schematic I had drafted on my own laptop long before it was ever proposed at work. Each file was dated, time-stamped, and annotated with notes like personal development, off hours, or conceptual model, not company assigned. I was creating more than just a backup. I was establishing a clear, unassailable timeline of creation and ownership, a digital fortress of fact that existed entirely outside their ecosystem and therefore entirely beyond their control. For 8 years, I had meticulously built their system. That night, I began meticulously building my case. The days that followed took on a strange dual quality. By day, I was the same quiet employee at Juno Corporation, performing my duties with a detached professionalism, my face a neutral mask. My colleagues saw nothing amiss. But by night, I was an archivist, a historian of my own intellectual property, meticulously constructing a fortress of evidence. My anger had cooled, replaced by a crystalline focus, a sense of purpose that I had not felt in years. I was no longer a victim of a broken system. I was a student of it. The message arrived on a Tuesday evening, not through a company email, but quietly, on my personal LinkedIn profile. It was from a man named Arthur Vance, the Chief Operating Officer at Helix, our largest competitor. The message was brief, direct, and devoid of corporate pleasantries. It read, "I've been analyzing the patterns in Juno's logistics for years. The architect behind them is playing a different game entirely. I would like to buy you dinner and discuss that game." I stared at the words for a long time. This wasn't a recruiter reaching out. This was a move on a chessboard I hadn't realized I was playing on. My first instinct was caution, the ingrained habit of someone who avoided office politics. But the archivist in me saw it differently. This was a crucial data point. To ignore it would be an error. After 24 hours of calculated silence, I replied with 2 words. "I'm listening." The restaurant he chose was not for corporate spectacle. It was a small, discreet establishment downtown, with low lighting and tables spaced for privacy. Arthur Vance was already there, a man in his late 50s with watchful, intelligent eyes. He was alone, a stark contrast to the performative importance of my own chief executive officer. He rose as I approached, his handshake firm and respectful. He didn't waste time. "Your work on the inventory flattening model for the Eastern Corridor," he began once we were seated. The way it anticipated port delays weeks before they were announced. That wasn't in the software. That was a human touch, a brilliant one. I remained silent, my expression unreadable. He saw the ghost in the machine. For 2 years, he continued, leaning forward slightly, we have tried to replicate the elegance of your system. We can't, because it's not just code, it's a philosophy, and that, Sarah, is not something Juno Corporation owns. He let the statement hang in the air. I am not asking you to bring us anything from Juno, he said, his voice low and serious. We don't want their platform. We want the mind capable of building something so far ahead of the curve. We want you to come to Helix and build your own vision from scratch. Triple your current salary, equity, and a new title, Director of Systems Architecture. Your name will be on your work, always. I didn't smile. I didn't gasp. I simply held his gaze, processing the offer not as a lifeline, but as a strategic proposal. The silence stretched. In Marcus's office, it had been a shield. Here, it was a tool for evaluation. He didn't ask me to steal anything. He asked me what I truly owned. And for the first time, looking at this man who saw my value more clearly from across the industry than my own boss did from across a desk, I realized I had the answer. The offer from Helix was not a lifeline. It was a key. It unlocked a door I hadn't realized I was standing in front of, revealing a future I could architect for myself. My decision was made before the dinner check even arrived. The archive I had been building was no longer a shield, it had become the foundation for my next chapter. I spent the following 2 days in a state of calm resolve, my interactions at Juno Corporation feeling like the final scripted scenes of a play I had already finished reading. My resignation letter was a model of professional neutrality. It was 1 paragraph long, printed on high-quality paper, and stated my intention to leave in 2 weeks. There were no grievances, no dramatic farewells, and no mention of the 12% or the laughter that followed. It was a document of pure transaction, a mirror of how they had always seen me, as a function, not a person. I sealed it in a plain white envelope and walked over to my direct manager's desk. David Chen was a man who lived in a state of perpetual low-grade anxiety. He managed by making himself invisible, a gatekeeper whose primary function was to buffer the senior executives from any unpleasantness. When I placed the envelope on his desk, he looked at it as if it were a venomous snake. His face, normally pale, seemed to lose another shade of color. "Sarah, what is this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I watched him read the few lines, his eyes widening as his words tumbled out in a frantic plea about deadlines, about projects in the pipeline, about not making any rash decisions. I realized he wasn't trying to save me for the company, he was trying to save himself from the fallout. I saw him scurry away toward the top floor, my letter clutched in his hand like a losing lottery ticket. I learned later, from a colleague in the executive support team, what transpired in that soundproof glass office. Marcus Thorne didn't read the letter. He simply listened to David's panicked explanation and let out an exasperated sigh. He saw my resignation not as a strategic exit, but as a negotiation tactic from a disgruntled subordinate. "Relax, David," he had said, waving a dismissive hand. "She's being emotional. She thinks she's irreplaceable. Wait a week, then go back and offer her 5%. People like her always think the grass is greener, but they never have the courage to actually jump the fence." That was his fatal miscalculation. He believed my defining characteristic was fear when in fact it had always been patience. He could not comprehend that my decision was not based on emotion, but on an overwhelming amount of data he had simply refused to see. For my final 2 weeks, I was a model of detached cooperation. I documented my tasks for a smooth handover, my fingers flying across the keyboard while my mind was already miles away, architecting new systems for a new employer. As I walked out of the Juno Corporation building for the last time, my access badge already deactivated, I felt no sadness or anger. I only felt the quiet hum of potential. They thought they had made me invisible, a ghost in their machine. They didn't realize I was the one holding the eraser. My first day at Helix was a study in contrasts. There were no grand pronouncements, no tours designed to impress. There was just a quiet office, a powerful computer, and a series of calm meetings with engineers and strategists who asked thoughtful questions and then listened, truly listened, to the answers. It was a culture built on curiosity, not ego. While I was sketching out the initial framework for a new transparent logistics system, the seeds I had left behind at Juno Corporation were beginning to bear their inevitable bitter fruit. It happened on a Monday morning, 10 days after my departure. Monday was the day the most critical report was generated, the weekly allocation forecast that determined the routing and cost for every shipment leaving our North American warehouses. For years, this report had been the bedrock of our operational efficiency, a document trusted implicitly with the flawless movement of millions of dollars in inventory. Everyone, from the warehouse floor to the chief executive officer's office, believed it was a fully automated, self-correcting marvel. The report ran at 8 o'clock, just as it always did. At first, no one noticed, but then a junior analyst flagged something that made no sense. A massive shipment of high-value electronics, meant for a priority client in Singapore, was now being routed through Anchorage, Alaska. Then another error appeared. A fleet of trucks was being dispatched to a supplier in Ohio that had been decommissioned 3 months prior. On screens across the department, the confident green of the cost projection dashboards had turned a sudden, alarming red. I can picture David Chen sweating in his office, fielding frantic calls. I can see the team huddled around a monitor, frantically digging through the code, searching for a bug, a corrupted file, a glitch in the software. But they would find nothing. The system was performing perfectly. The code was executing every command with flawless precision. They were searching for a flaw in the machine, never suspecting the flaw was in their own understanding. What they didn't know was that the system's perfection relied on a 5-minute human intervention every Monday morning. It was a simple manual override I performed at the start of each week, a single parameter I would adjust to account for the subtle, real-world chaos of the week prior, a weather delay in the Midwest, a small slowdown at a port in California. It was an adjustment based not on a rigid set of rules, but on 8 years of accumulated intuition. It was a task so small and routine that no one had ever asked me to document it. They had only ever praised the perfect result. They had never once asked about the process. I heard later that David sent out a frantic all-caps email with the subject line, "Urgent, all hands on deck, forecast debug," to the entire division. 10 minutes later, a system-generated message appeared in everyone's inbox. David Chen has recalled this message. The panic had become public, and now they were trying to make it invisible again. The system hadn't broken. It was simply doing exactly what it was told to do, without the one person who knew what to tell it, and I was already starting my new job. A month passed. At Helix, I was immersed in the deep, satisfying work of creation. We were designing a new architecture from the ground up, built on principles of transparency and adaptability. The chaos at my old company was a distant rumor, a whisper I'd occasionally hear from former colleagues who were now quietly updating their own resumes. They spoke of persistent glitches, of delayed shipments, and inexplicable cost overruns that management was dismissing as transitional friction. I didn't pry. I didn't need to. I had designed the system and I knew its tolerances. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon, not on my new work line, but on my personal cell phone from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but some instinct made me answer. The voice on the other end was young, strained, and spoke with a frantic energy that was jarringly familiar. "Sarah? Is this Sarah? My name is Jonah. I'm your replacement at Juno." I said nothing, letting the silence prompt him to continue. He spoke in a rush, his words tumbling over one another. He told me the anomaly from a few weeks ago was never fixed. It had become a constant, low-grade bleed. Small errors, daily miscalculations, forecasts that were always off by just enough to cause problems, but not enough to pinpoint a single source. He said he had been working 18-hour days, combing through the code, reverse engineering the logic. He was smart, he assured me. He knew the programming languages, he understood the architecture, but he couldn't stop the bleeding. And now, his voice cracked slightly, now they're blaming me. David says I must have changed a core parameter. Marcus Thorne told the entire management team that they may have overestimated the learning curve for the new hire. They're making it sound like I'm incompetent. He took a ragged breath. But I know I'm not. I've studied every line of code you wrote. It's perfect. It's like a work of art. But it feels like it's missing something, like it's missing you. The system wasn't just the code, was it? It was you. It was the most honest thing anyone from that company had ever said about my work. He had seen the truth that Marcus, in his corner office, had been blind to. He was asking for help, for a clue, for some secret key that would save him. He was asking me to fix the problem they had created. He was asking me to care. I listened to the rising panic in his voice, to the desperation of a man watching his career being scapegoated by the very people who had caused the failure. I thought about the 8 years I had given them. I thought about the sound of laughter in a soundproof room, and I thought about the new foundation I was building, a place where I would not be responsible for the errors of arrogant men. After a long silence, I said 4 words, my voice calm and devoid of any emotion. That's not my problem. Then I ended the call. A door had been closed a month ago. Now a wall was being built. At Helix, my focus was absolute, my work consuming. Yet, news from the outside world still found its way in. The industry was buzzing about Juno Corporation's impending triumph, a massive, 5-year exclusive contract with Cora Logistics, a deal rumored to be worth nearly $1 billion. It was the kind of company-defining victory that would erase a multitude of sins, justifying bonuses and sending stock prices soaring. I listened to the rumors with a detached irony, knowing the spectacular performance projections in that proposal were based on a system operating at a level of perfection that no longer existed. The first email arrived on a Monday, from a senior vice president in Juno's strategic accounts, a man I had met only once. The tone was professionally cheerful, carefully crafted to ignore the awkwardness of the situation. He wrote of the exciting final stages of the Cora deal and mentioned a minor piece of administrative housekeeping. Would I be willing, he asked, to provide a simple verification letter for the model's core assumptions? It was just a formality, he assured me, a box to be checked for the client's peace of mind. I read the email twice, savoring the bland corporate language that so cleverly concealed the underlying panic. They were asking me to stake my professional reputation on a system I knew was running on faulty premises, to guarantee a promise they could no longer keep. I moved the message to my archive, unanswered. 3 days later, a second email appeared. This time, it was from David Chen. His tone was stripped of all pretense of formality. It was a naked plea. He wrote that the Cura deal was the most important moment in the company's recent history, and that my sign-off was the final gating item. He practically begged me to just confirm the logic so they could finalize the contract. He mentioned my years of service as if it were a debt I still owed. This message joined the first one. The final email came on a Friday afternoon. The sender was Marcus Thorne. The polished, condescending tone I remembered from his office was gone, replaced by a clipped, strained urgency. Sarah, the message began, we need to close the loop on the Cora proposal. Your confirmation of the model's integrity is the last piece. It is imperative that we resolve this immediately. I stood in the evening light of my quiet office at Helix and thought about his choice of words. Close the loop, as if this were a minor loose end. They needed my name. The name they had never bothered to put on a newsletter, the name they had diminished in meetings, the name they had assured my replacement was easily forgotten. That name, my name, had somehow become the single most valuable piece of intellectual property they possessed, the final key to their biggest triumph, and they had willingly given it away for the price of a 12% raise. I didn't reply. I just let the email sit there, a ticking clock in their inbox, a silent testament to a question they should have asked themselves 8 years ago. They were asking for my name, the very thing they had spent my entire career trying to erase. The silence that followed was profound. A week after Marcus's final email, the news broke quietly through industry channels. The Cura Logistics deal, once hailed as Juno Corporation's salvation, was now officially paused pending further clarification. The word paused in the language of billion-dollar contracts is a euphemism for dead. The ticking clock in my inbox had finally run out, and the sound of its silence was deafening for them. For me, it was simply the predictable outcome of a flawed equation. I had expected them to be angry. I had expected them to scramble internally. What I had not fully anticipated was the sheer velocity of their desperation. It arrived at my new office not as an email, but as a thick, cream-colored envelope delivered by a courier. It bore the embossed name of a law firm I knew by reputation, a firm known for its aggressive scorched earth tactics. This was not a negotiation. This was a declaration of war. Inside, on heavy, formal paper, was a notice of legal action. The language was a storm of accusations, words designed to intimidate and overwhelm. They accused me of unauthorized removal of proprietary assets, of malicious misappropriation of trade secrets, of violating my employment agreement. They claimed that the entire logistics platform, the one I had architected on my own time and documented in my private archive, was, and always had been, the sole property of Juno Corporation. They were trying to retroactively claim ownership of the very work they had refused to acknowledge for 8 years. My hands did not shake as I read it. My heart rate did not quicken. I simply folded the papers, slid them back into the envelope, and walked down the hall to the office of Helix's chief legal counsel. She was a calm, sharp woman named Elena, who listened without interruption as I laid out the situation. I didn't even have to show her my archive yet. I just handed her the document from Juno's lawyers. She scanned the pages, her expression unchanging, until a small, knowing smile touched her lips. "This isn't a lawsuit, Sarah," she said, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the page. "This is a press release wrapped in legal paper. It's sloppy. It's the move a company makes when it's bleeding reputation and trying to create a public distraction. They're not trying to win in court. They're trying to wound you in the court of public opinion." As if on cue, a notification lit up my phone on the table between us. It was a headline from a major financial news service. Juno Corp sues former star architect alleging theft of billion-dollar platform. They hadn't even waited for me to be served properly. They had immediately leaked the story. They wanted to define the narrative, to paint me as a thief before I even had a chance to respond. They thought a lawsuit was a weapon. They didn't realize it was a stage. And they had just handed me the microphone. Their public attack was met with our private, methodical response. Juno's lawyers immediately filed for an emergency injunction, a legal move designed to stop me from working at Helix while the lawsuit proceeded. Their argument was that I was actively using their stolen intellectual property. It was a fast, aggressive maneuver intended to paralyze me and my new employer. It was also a fatal error because it forced the evidence into the light. In a quiet conference room at Helix, my lawyer Elena and I spent a day assembling the truth. We laid out my entire 8-year history, cross-referencing my personal, time-stamped archive with my official project assignments at Juno. The narrative that emerged was irrefutable. It showed years of independent, off-hours development, a clear line between my personal work and my corporate duties, and most damningly, a half-dozen email threads where I had offered my proprietary models to David Chen for formal acquisition, only to be met with silence or a casual, "let's implement and worry about the paperwork later." The paperwork never came. I did not attend the hearing for the injunction. Elena told me I didn't need to. She presented our evidence to the judge in a calm, logical sequence. There was no dramatic testimony, only an overwhelming presentation of documented facts. The judge's decision was delivered less than 48 hours later. It was brief and brutal. He denied their request, noting in his ruling that Juno Corporation had shown a shocking lack of due diligence in securing its own supposed assets, and that the plaintiff's case appeared to be profoundly weak. The story in the financial press changed overnight. The headline was no longer about a thieving employee. It was about an incompetent corporation. That ruling was the final straw. 2 days later, a major investment fund that held a significant stake in Juno issued a public statement. Citing the failed Cura deal and the public display of poor governance and reckless legal strategy, they announced they were divesting their entire position. That was the signal the market had been waiting for. The crack in the foundation became a chasm. From my office at Helix, I watched a financial news network on a muted television. The Juno Corporation stock ticker, once a steady line of green, was now a cascading waterfall of red, an avalanche from which there would be no recovery. The legal case was over in a flash, but the real judgment, the one from the market, was just beginning. The collapse was swift. Juno Corporation filed for bankruptcy protection within a month. Marcus Thorne was quietly dismissed by the board, a brief footnote in the financial press. The news barely registered with me. My focus was entirely on the future we were building at Helix, a company founded on the principles of transparency and respect, where good work was not just an outcome, but a celebrated process. One afternoon, I interviewed a familiar face for a position on my new team. Jonah, the young man who had replaced me. He was talented and earnest, a good engineer who had been caught in the gears of a broken machine. I hired him. In my new office, we don't have awards gathering dust on shelves. We have a large whiteboard that covers an entire wall. On it, we architect our systems, and next to every major component, there is a name. The creator is never invisible here. In the end, Marcus was right about one thing. He said his company rewarded architects. He just never realized that the quiet woman he saw as a janitor keeping the lights on was the one who had designed the entire building. And now, I was busy building cities. This story is a reminder that true power isn't always the loudest voice in the room. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is the most intelligent move on the board, a calculated strategy, not a retreat. My name was erased from their reports, so I built a legacy they could never own. If you have ever had to quietly walk away from a place that no longer saw your value, know that you are not alone in that silent strength. If this story spoke to you, like, comment, and share it with someone who's still finding their own voice.